would have climbed much faster than what they were used to. But the air conditioning packs were still producing a steady flow of cool, clean outside air. And there would have been no sudden loss of pressure or dramatic decompression, just a slow, steady failure to pressurize, something that we pilots refer to as a subtle decompression. At time 0611 and 21 seconds, the captain called up Nicoya ACC and advised that Helios Flight 522 was climbing through flight level 100 for 200. The controller responded and asked what cruise level that they requested, to which the captain responded flight level 340. And only a few seconds later, the controller cleared them to climb to flight level 340 as final, which would have meant that the autopilot was now set up for a continuous climb all the way up, which is worth keeping in mind. Now, in my airline, we do a secondary pressurization check as we climb through 10,000 feet, but there was no mention of something like that being done on board flight 522. Now, the reason we do that is because 10,000 feet is the threshold where above which the first signs of hypoxia can start to creep in, and is therefore also the cabin altitude where a warning is set to be activated. So at time 0812, as the aircraft climbed through roughly 12,000 feet, the cabin altitude, who was trailing just slightly behind the real aircraft's altitude, reached 10,000 feet, and that warning horn now went off. This was the cue for all trained pilots to immediately don their oxygen masks and revert to something known as memory items for cabin altitude warning or rapid depressurization. But on the Boeing 737, this same horn actually serves two different purposes. On the ground, if that warning is heard, it represents the takeoff configuration warning, alerting us pilots to the fact that something critical like flaps or trim is not set correctly for departure. But in the air, that same horn is used to warn us of excessive cabin altitude, which is now what was happening here. But that meant that the exact same sound was triggered by two completely different problems, separated only by context. So why was that then? Well, back when the Boeing 737 was designed in the early 1960s, cockpit warning sounds weren't digital files that could be selected in the way that later aircraft could. No, each alert required a physical horn with its own wiring, power, and panel space. So to cut complexity in an already crowded cockpit, Boeing chose to reuse the same horn for multiple warnings, relying on the face of flight to remove any ambiguity. This meant that, as this horn now went off, it did so because the cabin altitude had climbed through 10,000 feet, which to the original designers of the aircraft meant such a dramatically different scenario than the takeoff configuration warning that no one should ever confuse the two. But that assumption was built on a faulty premise of the human nature, one that took for granted that humans always react based on logic and not things like familiarity and habits. You see, to pilots, this horn is far more familiar in a very different specific context. During the pre-flight checks at the gates, we pilots routinely test the takeoff configuration warning by advancing the thrust levers to, a high setting, but with the engine still not running and the flaps still retracted. And by doing that reliably reproduces this exact same horn, showing us that the takeoff configuration system warning works. But it also means that cruise hears that warning in that context, as a takeoff configuration warning every single day. And by contrast, the cabin altitude warning is not tested in the same way, which means that most pilots will only hear that during simulator training, sometimes many years apart. So over time, this had created a powerful association. That horn now meant takeoff configuration warning, not pressurization warning. And the result here was that when this warning now activated, the pilots didn't immediately don their oxygen masks, as the procedure demanded. Instead, they misinterpreted this as an erroneous takeoff configuration warning, which needed to be fixed somehow. Now, this is an explanation, not an excuse. They were, after all, flying an aircraft with a history of pressurization problems, and a quick look at the tech log during the pre-flight would have shown the previous captain's notes and the following maintenance actions to the captain. But like I said earlier, there hadn't been any official handover from the engineers to this new crew during the morning. And also, this captain was known for not always following procedures, and the first officer was known for missing things under pressure. So maybe you can start to see how the holes in the Swiss cheese model now started lining up with safety barrier after safety barrier being crossed. Anyway, after interpreting the horn as a takeoff configuration warning, one of the pilots now disconnected the automatics and then briefly reduced the thrust levels towards idle. Whoever did that would have known that this warning shouldn't sound in the air, and on the ground, it's only armed when the thrust levers are advanced. So pulling the thrust levers back was a reasonable attempt to reset or maybe confirm what they believed was a false configuration alert. But then when the horn didn't stop, that still didn't prompt the crew to question their initial assumption. Instead, it seemed to reinforce the idea that something about the aircraft's configuration or systems just didn't make any sense, even though the exact cause to them remained unclear. Moments later, the autopilot and auto throttle was re-engaged, and the climb continued with a warning unresolved and still sounding in the background, which also likely added to their stress. Now, if you think that this mistake was a tragic oddity, you would be wrong. In fact, during the years leading up to this event, several 737 crews from around the world had made very same mistake, with consequences coming uncomfortably close to mirroring what was now about to happen. In one of the most serious ones, a Boeing 737 departing from Ireland in 2002 failed to pressurize after takeoff. And as it climbed, the cabin altitude warning horn sounded with the crew also assuming that they were dealing with the takeoff configuration problem. A flight attendant then tried to alert the pilots to growing discomfort in the cabin, but was told to stand by while they tried to diagnose what they believed was a nuisance warning. And it was only when the cabin altitude reached around 14,000 feet that the captain noticed that the air conditioning packs had never been turned on. Switching them back on then immediately restored pressurization, averting a further incident. But Irish investigators later wrote that the potential for a full-scale accident was self-evident, a warning that unfortunately went largely unnoticed. A similar incident then also happened in the U.S. when a 737 cruising at 37,000 feet experienced a slow loss of pressurization. When the warning horn finally sounded, both pilots initially assumed that it was the takeoff configuration warning, possibly linked to another sensor issue that they were already investigating. And it was only after a while that the first officer suddenly remembered that the takeoff configuration warning and the cabin altitude warning had the same sound, which made him realize what was now actually happening. The crew then quickly initiated an emergency descent and landed safely. But severely shaken by how close they had come, the captain later filed a confidential report saying that if the first officer hadn't made that connection, they might have continued troubleshooting until they lost consciousness. And that is actually another good point to raise here. You see, since this warning only activates when the cabin already is at or above 10,000 feet, hypoxia will quickly become a problem as the cabin continues to climb. And hypoxia will severely affect things like logical thinking, decision-making, and focus, making it even harder to change a course of action based on a faulty diagnosis. In any case, those two separate cases were only the most dramatic examples of at least a half a dozen known incidents involving the same fundamental design flaw. And the reports from those incidents had reached Boeing, who by 2004 was clearly aware of the issue. But rather than redesigning the whole system, Boeing instead added guidance in the flight crew training manual warning pilots that the two alerts sounded identical, and that revision was scheduled to take effect in October of 2005, which unfortunately was too late for the passengers and crew in this story. In the skies over Cyprus, instead of initiating an emergency descent, the captain now made a radio call, not to air traffic control, but instead back to Helios operations on the ground. And by coincidence, the maintenance technician who took that call was the same one who had performed the pressurization test during the night before. And as he made this call, other cues were now beginning to appear in the cockpit as to the true nature of the problem. But the captain still struggled to understand what was actually going wrong. His attention instead fixed on another indication that seemed abnormal: the equipment cooling off lights who had just now illuminated. You see, on the 737, the equipment cooling system uses cabin air to ventilate the avionics bay beneath the cockpit. And if it detects insufficient air flow or air density, Two lights labeled equipment cooling off illuminate to indicate that this important cooling has now been lost. So as Flight 522 climbed through roughly 16,000 feet with the cabin altitude now above 12,000 and still rising, those lights had illuminated together with a master caution warning. So the captain now reported this symptom to the engineer, telling him that both my equipment cooling lights are off. In reality, the warning lights labeled off were illuminated. But the captain's phrasing, likely influenced by his limited English, conveyed the complete opposite meaning, that the lights were off, which they should be, which greatly confused the engineer down on the ground. So he now asked the captain to clarify what he meant, but the captain just responded, "They are not switched off," to which he likely meant that he had not turned the equipment cooling system off, and therefore the lights off shouldn't have been illuminated. But this still didn't make any sense to the engineer. So the two men now kept talking past each other, whilst for every second the unpressurized aircraft climbed higher and higher. After a while, though, the engineer began to suspect what might be really going on. So he asked one simple direct question. Was the pressurization system set to automatic? But he didn't get any clear answer to that. Back in the cabin, the passenger oxygen masks now deployed automatically as the cabin altitude passed 14,000 feet, and that, if anything, should have been the final cue these pilots needed in order to figure out what was going on. But yet again, fate and poor training intervened. You see, when we pilots are dealing with technical issues in the 737, it's super important that we follow structured and well-defined steps. The pilot flying should concentrate on flying the aircraft, whilst the pilot monitoring should focus on troubleshooting the issue. And once a specific malfunction is identified through the master caution system, and of course some kind of action is defined, the master caution light must then be reset. The reason for this is that this arms the system for any other faults that might appear. But if the system is not reset, it will just stay illuminated, blocking the indication of something else happening. And that was now exactly what happened in this cockpit. The master caution light had activated when the equipment cooling off lights had illuminated. But instead of calling that out and starting the QR non-normal checklist, the captain had chosen to talk to the engineer instead and hadn't reset the system. So when the passenger oxygen system then activated with its own amber warning light in the overhead panel, this was never highlighted and likely therefore missed by both pilots, finally sealing everyone's fate. At time 0820, the captain asked the engineer where the equipment cooling circuit breakers were with the technician, then telling him that they were located behind his seat. And that exchange would be the last thing that anyone would ever hear from Helios Flight 522. As the aircraft climbed through 20,000 feet, the cabin altitude followed it upwards, and with it the effects of hypoxia now took over. Within minutes, both pilots would have lost useful consciousness, with the first officer slumping over his controls and the captain likely collapsing on the floor behind his seat as he was still looking for circuit breakers that had nothing to do with the situation. And this, of course, left the aircraft entirely in the hands of its automated systems. So, with the autopilot engaged and clear to climb to Flight 340 and the flight management system program for the whole route over to Athens, including the anticipated arrival approach and missed approach, Flight 52 just continued climbing exactly as commanded with an eerie silence inside of the cockpit. The aircraft soon leveled off cleanly at its assigned cruising altitude, and to anyone watching it from the ground, it appeared to be just another early morning airliner crossing the Mediterranean. But of course, inside of the cabin, the situation was now becoming truly bizarre. The passenger oxygen masks, which had deployed automatically, are connected to oxygen generators. So when they are activated, will chemically create oxygen for about 12 to 15 minutes or so. Now, that's normally more than enough to keep everyone conscious during an emergency descent down to the MSA or 10,000 feet, whichever is higher. But every one of those pressurization emergency scenarios was, of course,